Chloroform is much more powerful than ether, John Snow explained as he addressed the Westminster Medical Society in 1849. By now, ether had been used for anaesthesia for about 2 years. Chloroform had been introduced, and John Snow's experience in anaesthesia was making him an expert. The quantity of chloroform required to induce insensibility is less than 1/10 as much by measure as in the case of ether. Viewed in this manner, it is more than 10 times as strong. He was warning the audience that although chloroform had advantages over ether, it was dangerous in more sinister ways. Unfortunately, he went on, Dr. Simpson, to who we are indebted for its introduction, recommended it to be used on a handkerchief, and even held it out as one of the many advantages that it did not require any apparatus. And to this circumstance, many of the accidents that have occurred must, in my opinion, be partly attributed. Snow was laying the blame, or part of it at least, squarely at the feet of James Young Simpson, the Edinburgh obstetrician who discovered chloroform's anaesthetic properties. But doubts about its safety would be raised almost immediately, and it would all start with a toenail. Modern anaesthesia had started with ether, but now chloroform had been discovered, and in some people's minds, it was superior. The debate over ether and chloroform would make people consider the characteristics of a good anaesthetic drug, but it would also make them question whether the cost of progress was worth it. My name is Matthew Heron, and this is Ether Or. It's the story of the history of anaesthesia, the gases we once used to put people to sleep, and how the safety of patients became central to a modern speciality. Doctors were about to discover chloroform's dark side, but they'd also discover that their patients wouldn't be the only victims. Okay, Sophie, can you tell me the properties of the ideal inhalational anaesthetic agent?
So we can think of this in terms of different categories. In terms of their physical properties, we want an agent which is liquid at room temperature, want it to have a high saturated vapour pressure and a low latent heat of vaporisation, so that it requires less energy to vaporise.
For anaesthetists sitting their postgraduate fellowship exams like my colleague Dr. Sophie Boles, considering the properties of the ideal anaesthetic agent is a familiar question. It's more than just an intellectual exercise, because in considering the ideal drug, it helps highlight the limitations of the ones we actually have. When we think about anaesthetic drugs, we think about how quickly they work, how quickly they wear off, and what effects they have on the rest of the body.
We would want an agent which has a low blood gas partition coefficient, and this correlates with a faster rate of onset. We would also want an agent which has a high oil gas partition coefficient. This increases the potency of the agent. You want an agent which produces a rapid and predictable induction. It would be useful to have an agent which doesn't suppress a-minute ventilation. You want an agent which doesn't cause myocardial depression and doesn't reduce the blood pressure and is not arrhythmogenic.
In 1848, doctors were asking themselves the same question. Now they had not one, but 2 agents, and they wondered which was better, and what better really meant. Ether was slow to act, and it smelt terrible. It made patients cough and vomit, and as they went off to sleep, they progressed through a stage of agitation and needed to be held down. All this was manageable in experienced hands like John Snow's, but for those doctors giving ether infrequently, the patients complained it was unreliable, and it didn't always end up with an anaesthetised patient. One big problem was that as it evaporated to give off the vapour patients breathed in, it cooled. Cold ether gave off less vapour, so patients would inhale less, and that led to variable results. Recognising the problem, John Snow had developed an ether inhaler to ensure the amount of vapour inhaled was constant. But then chloroform had come along. It smelt better, and it didn't make patients sick. Because it was much more potent, you only needed a small bottle. James Young Simpson, who'd introduced it, advocated pouring it on a cloth held to the face, so doctors didn't need to carry a complicated inhaler either. All that made it extremely popular, as Dr. David Wilkinson, anaesthetist and former laureate of the Wood Library-Museum of Anaesthesiology, can tell us.
Once they'd started to use chloroform, the news about its use spread like wildfire across the country. It was remarkable. Simpson published within a few days of using the drug. Because it was available, chloroform had been used as a solvent and for various other things prior to this. So it was in a lot of pharmacies and there. So people started to try it.
Snow tackled chloroform with the same meticulous study he'd applied to ether, and where Simpson saw only benefits, Snow saw drawbacks. Chloroform was faster in its action, an advantage in Simpson's eyes, but to Snow this posed a potential problem. A quicker onset might be beneficial, but too quick, and it was difficult to observe the effects. Just a teaspoon or two induced what Simpson called a snoring sleep, and what Snow called the 4th degree of narcotism. The problem, as Snow saw it, was this. For chloroform to work, it had to pass from the lungs to the brain, resulting in a delay between administration and effect. This meant that as patients reached the 4th degree of narcotism, and the handkerchief was removed, they might have taken several more breaths of the vapour, and once that extra chloroform reached the brain, it could be enough to tip the patient into the 5th degree, where breathing stopped. On the 28th of January 1848, just 3 months after Simpson had introduced chloroform, a case of an ingrown toenail would confirm Snow's concerns.
And almost immediately, young fit people started to die. The most famous of these, the first one, was Hannah Greener. And she was a classic case. She was a young 15-year-old girl who had ingrown toenails. And the year before, in 1847, when ether came out, she had one of the toenails removed under an ether anaesthetic. And she didn't like that very much. She was very sick afterwards. So when she went along the next year to have the other toenail done, she said she didn't want that ether stuff, and was there anything else? And so they said, oh yes, we've got this new stuff, chloroform, why don't we try that? So she said, fine.
Doctors were figuring chloroform out as they went, and for Hannah it seemed like a good alternative. She was anxious, but with her in the chair, Dr. Megison poured a teaspoon of chloroform onto a cloth and held it to her mouth and nose. As Hannah breathed in the vapour, her breathing quickened. Dr. Megison felt her pulse getting faster, but then weaker. He pinched Hannah's cheeks to check the chloroform had worked, and Mr. Lloyd began the operation. Hannah gave a jerk, and assuming he hadn't given enough, Dr. Megison opened her eyes to check her pupils. But something was wrong, because Hannah's eyes were congested. Her mouth was hanging open, and her lips and face had turned white.
And as soon as they started administering the drug, after a few moments, they noticed that she'd arrested. She went very pale, stopped breathing. And of course, resuscitation in those days wasn't quite as we have it today. So resuscitation was to pour a little brandy down her throat.
Seeing that the brandy had had no effect, Megison placed Hannah on the floor and attempted to draw blood, but none flowed. Just 2 minutes after her first breath of chloroform, she was dead. Hannah's death was a stark realization for the doctors experimenting on their patients. Today, doctors training in anesthesia learn how the drugs we use work, what the side effects are, and how to mitigate them. But in 1848, doctors didn't understand how chloroform worked, or what other effects it might have on the body. And that meant that while some people believed that chloroform had been the cause of Hannah's death, others were reluctant to accept it. As the coroner's inquiry investigating Hannah's death published its conclusions, James Young Simpson, who'd introduced chloroform anaesthesia, published his own ideas about what had caused it.
At last, an alleged fatal case of its employment has been reported as having occurred in the practice of Mr. Megison of Winleighton, Newcastle, and a coroner's jury has returned a verdict of died from congestion of the lungs from the effects of chloroform. The unfortunate patient clearly died when under the influence of chloroform, not, however, as I believe, from its effects, but from the effects of the means used to revive her. I think this will be evident from the statement of a few of the particulars elicited at the inquest and published in the Lancet of Saturday last, and from Mr. Megison's own report of the case.
Simpson was convinced that the brandy used to revive Hannah had caused her death, but the uncertainty meant that some doctors didn't stop using chloroform, even when others started dying. For others, the bodies that would begin to pile up would be difficult to ignore. In 2020, Dr. Christine Ball gave a lecture titled Dark Matter, Stories from the Shadows. Chris is an anaesthetist in Melbourne, and she's a Wood Library-Museum of Anaesthesiology Laureate and honorary curator at the Geoffrey Kaye Museum of Anaesthetic History in Melbourne. Her lecture explored this story from a different perspective. The deaths under chloroform anaesthesia were clearly a tragedy for the patients and their families. But what was it like for the doctors whose patients died?
All these people were dying from chloroform anaesthesia, and, we just sort of look at it as a statistic and we wonder vaguely why they didn't stop using it. But it occurred to me it must have been quite traumatic. And Badger was one that worried me a lot because James Robinson had been very good at giving ether, and he was, one of the earliest protagonists of ether anaesthesia and obviously used it a huge amount in his dental surgery.
For Chris, the death of Mr. Badger 5 months after Hannah Greener was particularly troubling. Badger's dentist, James Robinson, was very experienced with ether, but when chloroform arrived, dentists quickly converted, because unlike ether, chloroform didn't make you salivate.
It's very difficult to do dental procedures when someone's salivating heavily, so they really enjoyed chloroform. And as far as I can work out from James Robinson's writings, he must have been giving about 100 chloroform anaesthetics a week, so he must have been using it all the time. I don't know how many extractions you can do in a week. And then when Badger died, and there was the whole sort of coroner's case, he said, well, I told him he didn't need it, and that it was an unnecessary risk. Now, that's a very strange thing to say if you've been giving it for months to hundreds and hundreds of patients. I'm not saying that he was making excuses for himself or accusing him of anything, just saying that we're all capable of that, of explaining a death in our own minds to deal with a traumatic event. That's what I think he was doing, was just saying, I said he didn't need it and he made me do it, sort of thing. And I can see that, it would have been a really traumatic event to have someone it's his front parlour where he's doing dental surgery. There's just suddenly a dead body. Now, that's not something that dentists expect to happen. The only people he's got there is butler and his maid. And, made me realise that these were human beings with a real story to tell and a really horrifying experience. He was helped through it all by John Snow looking at it and saying, I don't think that was due to chloroform. I think he had fatty degeneration of the heart and it's not your fault. And that must have made him feel a lot better to have somebody who had a scientific approach to it. So somehow he got through what must have been a very traumatic event. But I think it's interesting to look at that narrative around Mr. Badger and see that that's presumably how he coped with it. He removed himself from the decision making in a way.
Chloroform's fast onset, potency, and reliability made it a convenient and effective drug for doctors, and for patients it was better tolerated and it didn't make them sick. So you can see why doctors were keen to use it. The deaths associated with it were obviously a problem, but as they continued, they provide John Snow with the motivation to apply his methodical, scientific mind to the problem. He began a series of experiments with chloroform, testing it on frogs, birds, cats, and guinea pigs.
John Snow very quickly started doing scientific experiments with animals, with chloroform, and he discovered that, they universally died if you gave them about 8%. If you gave them 4% for a while and then took them out of the chloroform, they would wake up again. He actually came up with a figure of 2% for maintenance of anaesthesia, but he said you would never get anyone off to sleep quickly enough with 2%. So 4% was the safe figure he came up with for induction. And then he said if you needed a long period of time, that 2% would be enough for maintenance of anaesthesia. The inhaler he developed for chloroform actually delivered 5%, which was a bit more than he wanted. But with valves in the masks and a bit of dilution around the mask, he figured he was never giving much more than 4% anyway.
What Snow discovered with his animal experiments was that with higher concentrations of chloroform, the breathing of the animals he experimented on would stop, and a cardiac arrest would follow a minute or so later. But if he gave less, he could induce sleep without affecting the breathing, and his mind made the logical step. If he could limit the amount of chloroform to his experimentally proven safe concentration of 4%, he could make chloroform safer. James Young Simpson had recommended chloroform be dropped on a cloth held to the face. But using that method, Snow realised there was no way to reliably regulate the dose. If he could persuade people to use his inhaler instead, he could reduce the risk of overdose and prevent anyone else from dying. That might sound simple in principle, but Snow would meet opposition that would separate England and Scotland not just by a geographic border, but by an ideological divide. Despite these early deaths with chloroform, there were plenty of success stories too. It wasn't the case that every patient who breathed it in suddenly dropped dead. In fact, some doctors like Joseph Clover were becoming very skilled at using it. Clover had wanted to be a surgeon, but after he got his qualifications, he gave a lot of anaesthetics, and he got very good at it. When John Snow died in 1858, the surgeons who had come to rely on his skills in anaesthesia looked for a replacement, and Joseph Clover fit the bill. Like Snow, he had begun to dedicate his practice solely to anaesthesia, and he designed his own inhalers based around Snow's principle of a safe dose of 4%.
It was really complicated, but also very clever. So Snow had worked out if you injected a known amount of chloroform into a known amount of air, you could work out what percentage of chloroform to give. And he would do that with a big bag for all his animal experiments. And he did try it a few times with people, but you needed a really big bag, and he just couldn't work out how to do it. So Clover spent a lot of time designing this apparatus that in the end was an enormous bag with a piece of tubing off it, which then connected to the preparation apparatus. And his preparation apparatus was a syringe full of chloroform that he would inject into a cylinder that had some warm water and blotting paper in it, so that when he injected the chloroform into there, it would all evaporate. And then he would inject, with some bellows, he would force a known amount of air through that vaporizing chamber and into the bag. And he would repeat that over and over and over till he had a bag full of 4% chloroform. And then he would turn a tap so that the bag was then shut off. And then he'd attach a mask to the end of the bag. So he'd detach it from the apparatus that he'd prepared it with and put a mask on the end. And then he'd have a whole full bag. He could anaesthetize a number of people with that bag.
Despite their efforts to make it safer, neither Snow nor Clover made it through their careers without fatalities. Snow wrote about his in his published analysis of the first 50 chloroform deaths, but you have to skip to the back to find them, listed with the alleged deaths under chloroform. Whether that's appropriate or not, it's hard to imagine that he wasn't just a bit biased about his own work. Joseph Clover had 4 deaths while administering anaesthesia, though not all of them were due to chloroform. The first was from an inhaled tooth. It wasn't a consequence of the drug, but it was in a way a consequence of anaesthesia. Presumably the tooth wouldn't have been inhaled had the patient been awake. John Snow had supported James Robinson after the death of Mr. Badger, and now Joseph Clover would turn to his colleagues for support.
Clover's experiences I know a lot about because I have all his personal papers, and we're very lucky that he left a lot of letters. What letters he chose to keep and which letters he discarded, I don't know, but he did keep a number of letters and drafts of things about these deaths under anaesthesia. Alfred Coleman, who was the dentist involved, wrote to Clover, and Clover kept that letter saying, I hope you're all right. This was a terrible thing that happened. We all bear some responsibility for it, but you least of all, because everyone knows how careful you are. And I think that's such an interesting letter that these men who obviously were working together every day and seeing each other would bother to put it on paper. We don't tend to see that side of surgeons and doctors from the past, but that's a very humane and sort of gentle thing to have done, and very caring. The following year, he had his first death under chloroform anaesthesia that he couldn't explain. And at that stage, he'd been giving anaesthetics for over 20 years without a death. So that must have been really confronting. And it was with his chloroform apparatus. And up to that point, he had believed that he got away without having any deaths for over 20 years because his apparatus was safe. Now, I can't explain why he never had any deaths, because chloroform's just dangerous. It doesn't really matter how you give it. Sooner or later, someone's going to die. And then the following year, he had a death which was published, which was not with his chloroform apparatus. That was with a sort of what he called a blowing apparatus, where he was blowing air with a foot pump over, I think, what must have been like a Junkers inhaler for an oral operation. And he was really upset about that because he thought he shouldn't have been using that apparatus. He'd just developed it. He obviously never took it to market, and he never used it again because he attributed that death to that.
Clover must have had real confidence in his ability with chloroform to have anaesthetised people for over 20 years without deaths, only to then experience 2 in quick succession. You can imagine how difficult it must have been for him to go back to work and use chloroform again, now in possession of the knowledge that his experience and his efforts to make chloroform safe in the end hadn't protected his patients. Chris's research into the emotional impact of these deaths on some of the doctors experiencing them gives us a rare glimpse into the personal stories behind the sentinel events in medical history. And it helps us reflect on the impact of some of the unique stresses experienced by people working in healthcare today. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has helped throw a light on the mental health of healthcare staff, and with staff leaving in the wake of the pandemic, tackling workplace stress, burnout and mental health problems has never seemed so urgent. Through her research, Chris has shown that although we might be paying more attention to these issues, they certainly aren't new.
The more interesting person to me in terms of mental health is Henry Potter. And Henry Potter is a man who we don't know a lot about. He worked at St George's. At the time of John Snow's death, Henry Potter wrote he and John Snow had the greatest experience of anyone in England in anaesthesia. So obviously he was very experienced. But he had a death very early on using Snow's inhaler, and that death's written up in Snow's book. But then after John Snow died, around about 1868, so about 10 years later, Henry Potter had kept being the chloroformist to St George's, and then he had another death from chloroform. And he gave up practice straight away. He stopped practicing anaesthesia. He never gave another anaesthetic. He handed over his whole practice to somebody else and sold his London house and left and retired. So clearly that had a devastating effect on him. We don't know any more about it than that, except that that's what happened. But obviously that was really a catastrophic event for him.
Whilst Henry Potter dealt with his chloroform death by giving up medicine altogether, it gave Snow and Clover the motivation to try and make chloroform safer. They hoped the inhalers they developed would help to reduce the deaths associated with chloroform's use, but they flew in the face of the principles of chloroform anaesthesia set out by James Young Simpson. For him, one of chloroform's great advantages over ether was that you didn't need an inhaler, and in Scotland, doctors had followed Simpson's teaching, rapidly inducing anaesthesia with larger amounts of chloroform on a cloth. Simpson aggressively rejected any attempt to introduce chloroform inhalers, writing that some of the instruments being produced would asphyxiate patients. He said, "I have seen some very pretty ones that no one could breathe with." In his mind, if doctors were experiencing deaths with chloroform, it was their negligence and not his technique that was the culprit. As more patients died, Simpson and his followers argued that doctors simply weren't paying enough attention. If only they'd watched their patients breathing properly as chloroform was being administered, the moment the breathing faltered, the chloroform could be withdrawn and the patient would be saved. In London, unconvinced by the Scottish argument, doctors like Snow and Clover continued to advocate for the use of inhalers to limit the concentration of chloroform and prevent overdose. By 1858, there had been 50 chloroform deaths, giving Simpson plenty of opportunity to apportion blame to all those who didn't follow his technique. And they presented John Snow with opportunity too. Applying his scientific mind to the first 50 chloroform deaths, he began to notice something different and altogether more concerning. The deaths were continuing, regardless of how doctors were giving chloroform. There certainly seemed to be fewer deaths with inhalers, but if people were dying as a result of chloroform overdose, why hadn't the deaths stopped completely in cases where inhalers were used? What's more, Snow was noticing a pattern in the deaths he reviewed that was even more troubling. In his initial animal experiments with 10% chloroform, the breathing would stop first, but the heart would beat distinctly for a minute or longer before stopping. But in the human deaths, that pattern seemed to be different. One death in particular, published in the Medical Times and Gazette in 1857, caught Snow's attention. The symptoms were observed with unusual care, he said, and described with great clearness. Hence the case is one of more than ordinary value, as illustrating the manner in which accidents from chloroform can occur. The chloroform in this case had been given on a cloth by one Mr. Paget, who had paid particular attention to closely observe his patient in every way he could. Perhaps that was his usual practice, or perhaps given the ongoing deaths, Mr. Paget was paying close attention to try to avoid one. Whatever the reason, he had placed a finger on the pulse of the young boy he was anaesthetising, and as well as watching how quickly or slowly he breathed, he also felt with his fingertips the strength, the rate, and the rhythm of the patient's pulse. The boy took a long, deep breath of air strongly charged with chloroform from the cloth held an inch from his face. According to Paget's description, the pulse, which had until now been normal, suddenly began to beat very quickly. Then it ceased for 2 or 3 seconds, then beat rapidly several times with kind of flickering movements, and then ceased to be perceptible. In this case, the heart itself seemed paralysed by the chloroform before the boy had even inhaled enough to get himself off to sleep. As his heart sat unable to pump blood and oxygen around the body, his breathing had continued for a minute before stopping for good. Mr. Paget's patient was dead. It was sudden and unexpected, just like Hannah Greener's death had been almost 10 years earlier. Mr. Paget had closely watched his patient's breathing, and it hadn't saved him. But by placing a finger on the pulse, his experience was proof of what John Snow now realised. There was not one cause of death with chloroform, but 2. One in which too high a concentration of chloroform would gradually stop the patient's breathing, and one in which the chloroform itself, through some unseen action on the heart, would cause it abruptly and catastrophically to stop, something he called cardiac syncope. Gradually and progressively inducing sleep with chloroform, Snow and his followers in London would now watch the breathing and keep a finger on the pulse. But for James Simpson and his followers in Scotland, the many advantages of chloroform over ether were being lost, all in an effort to protect patients from a risk they didn't believe existed. They worried that doctors feeling for a pulse during chloroform anaesthesia would neglect to watch the breathing altogether, and in their minds, that was where the real danger lay. They accepted that too much chloroform could stop you breathing, but they didn't believe Snow's theorised cardiac syncope actually existed. For them, the purity of Simpson's method was being undermined. Chloroform's reliability and simplicity was what had set it apart from ether, and in a time when most anaesthesia was given for operations in the home, like Hannah Greener's had been, they were adamant that if you'd only pay attention, you could give chloroform safely, quickly inducing anaesthesia by dropping larger amounts on a cloth and then taking it away if the breathing became laboured.
There's a wonderful description of somebody drawing up in his coach and horses outside the house, in a full frock coat and top hat, and walking into the house, taking off his top hat where he had his wireframe mask. So he took his anaesthetic machine out of his hat, reached into his pocket for the small bottle of chloroform and put the patient to sleep. That's quite hard to do with a standard anaesthetic machine nowadays.
As chloroform use increased, by the 1870s there were as many as 1 death a week, and in the United States, at the Massachusetts General Hospital, where ether anaesthesia was first demonstrated, chloroform was forbidden. But in the UK, doctors seemed content to carry on using it. The fact that even John Snow didn't give it up tells us just how much better chloroform must have been to give. Or maybe the hubris of men like Snow and Clover allowed them to use chloroform in the flawed logic that in their hands it was safe. The problem was obviously not going away, but for now, John Snow would have the last word. Writing in response to a letter from the Edinburgh surgeon James Syme, Snow explained that the London technique wasn't to monitor the pulse at the expense of everything else, and whilst in Scotland they removed the chloroform when the breathing became loud and stertorous, in London the aim was to remove it after the patient became insensible, but before the breathing was ever even affected. Snow's scientific approach was allowing him to learn from his vast experience, refine his technique, and make anaesthesia safer. He said, in speaking of London as a place where deaths from chloroform have occurred and Edinburgh as a place where they have not, Mr. Syme seems entirely to overlook the relative size and population of the two places. When these circumstances are taken into account, the mortality from this cause seems to be pretty equal. He went on, Mr. Syme says that chloroform is given in Edinburgh according to principle, and in London according to rule. It is my opinion that the rules of some of us here proceed from the principles we have taken great pains to ascertain and establish. Whether they were giving it by principle or by rule, by now there was no doubt that chloroform could be fatal. But for James Young Simpson and his followers, there were still questions about whether chloroform-induced cardiac syncope really existed. And in an age where your chance of dying from surgery was so high, did this additional risk really make any difference? For one surgeon at Guy's Hospital in London, it didn't. Speaking at an inquest, he said, so strong and powerful an agent was chloroform that it could not be administered without some amount of risk and danger, and the penalty the public must pay for the alleviation of pain would be a death occasionally. It was a stark message, making doctors question their own ambivalence about chloroform's risks, and it makes us question whether the ends ever truly justify the means. For John Snow, they didn't. His study of ether and chloroform allowed him to root his technique in science. He was developing the speciality from principles of physiology, pharmacology, and physics. That's why you can still find him today, along with Joseph Clover, on the coat of arms of the Royal College of Anaesthetists. For James Young Simpson, chloroform was nothing but a success story, and in some ways he was right. because it forced doctors to question what a good anaesthetic drug might look like and how it might behave, something we still think about today. But this progress came at a price, the cost measured in the lives lost. The deaths and the debates would continue, and chloroform would find new champions determined to silence the critics, and their quest would take them around the world to India. That's next time on Either Or. Thanks to Dr. Sophie Boles for letting me record her exam preparation. Thanks also to Dr. David Wilkinson for his expertise, and to Dr. Christine Bull for sharing her research for this story. The voice of James Young Simpson was provided by the journalist and broadcaster Alan Jenkins. Our music was composed by Nicola Chang, and this episode was written, recorded and edited by me, Matthew Heron. Please rate, review and subscribe to Either Or. It helps other people find the show. Thanks for listening.